Hi everybody, welcome to Live Blogger. I have combined all the videos in our budget tracker application design series into the single long video so that it's easy for you to follow. Now in this video, we're going to basically build this budget tracker application using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. And in the end, I will also show you how to add this to your Blogger website. And I will also leave the link of the source code in the description of this video. So let's get started. So let me show you how this works. We can see that we have this balance displayed over here, and we can add transaction for the income and expense. So here we can see we have the transaction list displayed on the right side, and this is also responsive. So if you decrease the width of the browser window, this is how it will look on smaller screens. We have the transaction list displayed at the bottom. And let's go back to the desktop version, and here we can add different transaction amounts and the description. So for example, let's add a new income over here. So let's type web development, and let's add an amount over here. And let's select income and let's click on add transaction. And now we can see that that amount is added over here in the balance, and we have it displayed over here on the right side in the transactions list. And we can also delete any of these. So for example, if I want to delete this Spotify subscription, you can just go over here to delete. And it will be deleted from this balance as well. So it will calculate the balance based on the transaction list that we have over here on the right side. And in the same way, we can also add the expense, and it will be removed from this balance. So for example, let's type rent, and let's set the amount to 1,200. And let's change this to expense, and let's click on add transaction. Now we can see that the rent was added here in the transaction list, and the amount was deducted from the balance. Now if the balance is in negative, this will have a different color. So let's go ahead and remove some of these income from here. And now we can see that we have a balance of negative $1,250, and it has this red color over here. And now if we add a new income, and let's go ahead and type salary, and let's set the value to 1,500. And let's select income and click on add transaction. Now we can see that we have the correct balance over here. We have the correct color for the balance as well. And then on the right side, we have the salary being displayed. So this is how this budget tracker works. Now we're going to design this from scratch using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. And we are storing this transaction list inside a local storage. So even if you reload this, the values still persist. In this first video, we'll just design the UI, and in the next video, we will add the functionality. So let's get started. Right here, I have created this folder called budget tracker, and I just opened it with VS Code. Now let's create the necessary files. Let's create a new file called index.html. And let's create another file called style.css. And let's create one more file called main.js. And let's start with the index.html file. Now in VS Code, you can just type exclamation and press tab, and you'll have this basic HTML5 code. And here for the title, let's type budget tracker pro. And let's link our CSS file over here. So let's type link and press tab. And here in the href, let's type style.css. And here in the body, let's type script:src. And here, let's type main.js. Right now, let's start with the markup of our design. Now here, the first thing we will do is we'll create a container division, and let's give it a class of app container. And then if you go back to our design, here we can see that we have this section on the left side, and we have this section on the right side. And for the left side, we'll just give it a class of input container. So let's type input container. And in this, we need to have a header. So let's create a division with the class of header. And here, let's create an h1, and let's add this text over here. So I'll just copy this and paste it over here. Now, if you want to open this emoji picker, you can just press Control, Command, and Space on Mac, and it will open this. And you can just go ahead and double click on this, and it'll be added to your code. And I think you can do that in Windows as well, and there might be a different shortcut for that. Right now, let's go outside this, and let's create a division, and let's give it an ID of balance. And here we'll type balance, and let's set the balance to 0.00 for now. And let's open this in our browser, and let's see how it looks. So I have this extension called Live Server installed in VS Code. So once you have this extension installed, you can just right click over here in the HTML file and click on Open with Live Server. And here we can see that our design is displayed in the browser. Let's go back, and let's go ahead and continue designing our web page. The next thing we will do is we'll create this form. So for that, let's create a form element, and let's remove the action and let's give it an ID of transaction form. And here let's add an input field and let's set the type to text. Let's add an ID of description, and let's also add a placeholder of transaction description, and we'll set it to required. And here we have this transaction description input field, and then we have another one for the amount. So let's create an input field. Let's set the type to number. Let's set the ID to amount, and let's set a placeholder of amount, and let's set this to step of 0.01. So if we go ahead and add some value, if you click on these icons, it will have this step that we provided. So let's go back and let's also make this required. And then lastly, we have a drop down. So in the drop down, we have income and expense. So let's go back and let's create a select element. And for the ID, let's go ahead and type, and this will also be required. So let's type required over here. And in the select, we need to have options. And for the first value, let's type income. And here, let's add the text for income. So let's go ahead and type income. And we'll also add an emoji. Let's press Command Control space. And let's search for money. And let's select this one right here. All right, now let's go ahead and duplicate this. And the next thing we have is expense. And for the expense, let's have a different emoji. So let's open that once again, and let's search for credit card, and let's select this one right here. And then lastly, we need to have a button. So let's go outside this select and let's create a button element. And here let's type add transaction, and here let's type to submit. And now we can see that all the elements that we need for the left section are completed. All right, now let's write the HTML for the right section, which is the transactions container. So let's go outside this container, input container, and here let's create a division with the class of transactions container. And let's add an h2 over here, and let's type transactions. Now in here we need to have the list of all the transactions. So let's create a division with an ID of transaction list. And in that we need to have different transactions. Now we will generate all of this using JavaScript when we add the functionality, but for now we'll just add it directly over here in the HTML so that we can style it better. So let's go ahead and create a div with the class of transaction, and let's also give it a class of income. And in this we need to have the description and the amount and the delete button. So let's create a span, and in the span let's add a description. So I'll just type freelance work, and let's create one more span, and in this span we need to have the amount and also the delete button. So let's add an amount over here. So let's type $500, and in this span we will create a button, and let's type delete over here. And for the button, let's add a class of delete btn, and we'll also give a class to the span. So let's type class, and let's set the class to transaction amount container. And now just go ahead and copy and paste this a couple more times. And for the second and third one, let's change this to expense. So we'll have different colors for the expense. And with that, we have added all the HTML of our design. So if you go back to our web page, this is how it looks. Now let's go ahead and style this using CSS. So we'll make it look like this. So let's go to our CSS file. And first of all, let's add some CSS variables. So let's type :root, and we will add all the variables inside here. So let's type --, primary color, and let's set the value to 4A90E2. And for the secondary color, let's set it to 2ECC71. Now, when we add variables for the colors, you'll be able to change it pretty easily. And if you make changes over here in one place, it will be changed in all the places of your app. So whenever it is possible, just try to create CSS variables for the colors. And let's create a color for danger. So let's type danger color, and let's set it to a red color. So let's type E74C3C. And let's also add a color for the card background. So let's set it to white. And Now let's go ahead and select everything, and let's set the margin to 0, padding to 0, and the box sizing to border box so that we have the correct height and width for all the elements. And now let's go ahead and select the body, and let's set the font family to Inter Sans Serif, and let's set the background color to F7, F9, FC, and let's set the color of all the text to 2C, 3E50, and let's set the line height of all the text to 1.6. Right now let's target the main container division, which is this division with the class of app container, and we need to have the input container and the transactions container one next to the other. So we need to set the display to flex for this app container. So here let's type app container, and let's set the display to flex. Let's add a gap of 2 rem, and let's set the width to 100%, and let's set the max width to 1200 pixels, and let's set the margin to 2 rem auto. And let's go back to our design, and this is how it looks. We can see that we have the input container on the left side and the transactions container on the right side. Now we need to set the width of both these to the same value. So for that we can just go ahead and target those divisions. So let's tap input container, let's set the flex to 1, and even for the transactions container, let's set the flex to 1. And now we can see both of them have the same width. Right now let's go back to the input container, and let's set the background color to the variable that we created called card background. So let's tap var card background, and let's set the border radius to 12 pixels, and let's add a box shadow of 0, 10 pixels, 25 pixels, RGBA, 0, 0, 0, and 0.05, and this is how it looks. Let's also add a padding. So let's set the padding to 2 rem. And let's also do almost the same thing for the transactions container. So I'll just copy these styles from here and add it over here. And here we will also set a max height. And let's set the max height to 560 pixels. And we'll set the overflow Y to auto. So now it will have a height of 560 pixels at max. And if it exceeds that, it will scroll. Right now let's continue styling the other elements. So we have a header over here. So let's style that. Let's tap dot header, and let's set the text align to center, and let's add a margin bottom of 1.5 rem. Right now let's target this h1. So let's tap header h1, and let's set the font size to 2 rems. Let's set the font weight to 700, and let's set the color to var primary color. Right now let's target this balance. So let's go ahead and type the ID over here. So we have an ID of balance. So let's type hash balance, and let's set the text align to center, and let's set the font size to 2.5 rems, and let's set the font weight to 700, and let's set a margin of 1.5 rem 0, and this is how it looks. Right now let's target this form. So for the form we have this form with an ID of transaction form. So let's target the ID. I'll just type transaction form, and let's set the display to grid, and let's set a gap of 1 rem. Right now let's select the input fields and the select element and also the button. So let's tap input, select, button, and let's set the width to 100%. Let's set the padding to 0.75 rem, and let's set the border to 1 pixel solid E0, 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 and let's also add rounded corners. So let's tap border radius of 8 pixels, and let's set the font size to 1 rem. Right now let's also style the focus. So when we click on this, we can see that we have this border around the element. So let's go ahead and type input colon focus and select colon focus, and here we'll just set the outline to none, and let's set the border color to var primary color, and let's also add a box shadow when we have the focus. Let's set it to 0, 0, 0, 3 pixels, RGBA, 74, 144, 226, and 0.1. So this is how it looks. Right now let's style this button. So let's tap button, and for the button let's add a background color of var primary color, And let's set the color of the text to white. Let's set the border to none. Let's set the cursor to pointer. Let's set the font weight to 600. Now when we hover over this button, we need to have a little bit of hover effect. So let's go back and let's tap button colon hover. And let's tap background and let's set the background color to #3A 7B D5. And let's tap transform, translate Y of -2 pixels. So it will move up a little bit, and let's also add a transition right here. So let's tap transition and let's set the value to all 300 milliseconds ease. Alright, now let's style all the transactions. So for that, let's go back over here to the HTML file. And if you scroll down here, we can see that for each of the transaction, we have this class of transaction. So let's style that. I'll just tap transaction and let's set the display to flex, and let's set the justify content to space between. And now we can see that the description is on the left side and we have the other content on the right side. Let's also align items to the center. Let's set a padding of 1 rem. Let's set the border radius to 8 pixels and let's add a margin bottom of 0.5 rems. Now for the income, we need to have a different background color, and for the expense, we need to have a different one. So here we can see we have these classes income and expense. So let's type transaction.income. And here let's add a background color of RGBA 46, 204, 113, 0.1 for the opacity. So this is for the income. And when you hover over this, we need to have a different color. So let's do that as well. I'll just tap transaction, colon hover. And let's add a background color of RGBA 000 and 0.05. And let's also add a smooth transition over here. So let's tap transition of all 300 milliseconds ease. Right now for the expense, let's add a different color. So I'll just copy this and paste it down here. Let's change this to expense. And let's change the color to 231, 76, 60 and 0.1. Right now we need to style this right side. We need to have these two elements one below the other, and they should be on the right side. So let's style that. We have this division with the class of transaction amount container. So let's style that. So let's type dot transaction amount container, and let's set the display to flex, flex direction to column, and let's tap align items to flex end, so it will be on the right side. And now let's style this delete button. So for the delete button, we have this class of delete btn. So let's target that. I'll just tap delete btn. Now let's add a background color of var danger color. Let's also set the padding to 8 pixels. And let's set the font size to 0.8 rem. Let's set the border radius to 4 pixels. And when we hover this button, we need to have a different color. So let's tap delete button colon hover. And let's tap background color and let's set it to C039-2B. And we will not move this up when we hover over this. So for that, let's tap transform, translate Y of 0, and let's add a smooth transition over here. So let's tap transition of all 300 milliseconds ease. So now we can see we have the color change for this button. Now here we can see that we have a lot of height for this left section. That's because of this right section. So if we add some more elements on the right side, so if we just copy this transaction and paste it down here, we can see that the same height is set for this one as well. So if you want, you can also set the height to fit the content of the section. So for that, let's go back to the style.css file and let's go to the input container, and here let's add height to fit content. And now it will have the correct height for the section according to the content. Now we need to have a gap between this heading and this transaction list. So if you go back to the HTML file, here we can see we have this division with an ID of transaction list. So let's add a margin top for that. So here, let's go ahead and type transaction list, and let's set the margin top to 1.5 rem. So now everything looks all right. So with that, we have designed our budget tracker UI for the desktop version. Let's also make it responsive. So on smaller screens, we need to have these displayed one below the other. So let's add a media query. I'll just type @media, and let's set the max width to 768 pixels, and let's tap app container, flex direction to column. and padding of 1 rem. So this is how it looks on smaller screens. And let's also reduce the size of this balance on smaller screens. So for that, let's type hash balance, and let's set the font size to 2 rem. So that's basically it with the design of the mobile version. So with that, we have designed our budget tracker application. This is our source code, and here if you go to the end, here we can see that we have linked our main.js file in the index.html file. So let's go to the main.js file and let's start adding our functionality. So the first thing we will do is we will remove these dummy transactions from here. And let's remove all of this. I'll just keep 1 for reference. And if you go back here, we can see that we have this 1 transaction. And let's go ahead and use a class-based approach this time to write our code. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a class called budget tracker, and we're going to instantiate the class. So let's go ahead and try doing that. I'll just create a class called budget tracker. And this is our budget tracker class. And in this, we need to have different methods and properties. So first of all, let's create a constructor. Now, a constructor is basically a method that runs whenever the class is instantiated. So whenever we go ahead and create a new budget tracker, so if we just type budget tracker equals new budget tracker, then the constructor will run automatically. So let's go ahead and create a constructor. So we can just type constructor, and here we can add the code. So this code will be basically used to initialize our project. So let's go ahead and create a property called transactions. So we need to type this dot transactions, and we need to set it to a function that will load our transactions. So let's type this dot load transactions. Now let me explain to you what this is. So this is basically a keyword in JavaScript to reference the object. So if you create this budget tracker object over here, and if we instantiate the object, then this will reference to the transaction of this current object that we just instantiated. And if we create one more object, so if you just type budget tracker 2 equals new budget tracker, and now if you go ahead and use these transactions inside this second one, then the transactions of the second object will be used. So in this way, we can make sure that the transactions property of the current object is being used. So that's why we need to use this keyword. And we're going to create this method called load transactions for this. Right now, the next thing we will do is we'll also reference the HTML elements in the constructor. So let's tab this dot form equals, and we need to reference the form. So here, if you go to our HTML, here we have this form with an ID of transaction form. So let's go back and type equals document dot get element by ID, and here let's type transaction form. And then we also need to reference the transaction list. So here we have this division with an ID of transaction list. So let's reference that as well. I'll just type this dot transaction list equals document dot get element by ID, and let's type transaction list. And then lastly, we need to reference the balance element. So here we have this div with an ID of balance. So let's reference that as well. So let's type this dot balance element equals document dot get element by ID, and let's type balance over here. And then we also need to run some methods in this constructor. So we'll create a method called init event listeners, and this will create the event listeners for our project. So basically, we're going to add event listener to the form. So when we submit the form, we need to do something with the data. And then let's call a method called render transactions, and we'll create the method in a minute. So let's type render transactions. And then we'll also call a method called update balance. So this is basically our constructor. So in the constructor, we are basically loading all the transactions and adding it to this transactions property. And then we are referencing the form, transaction list, and balance elements from the HTML. And then we are calling these methods. So now let's go ahead and create these methods. We'll just create empty methods for now for some of these. So let's type load transactions. And in this, we'll just return an empty array. And then let's create another method, which is init event listeners. And we'll just leave it blank. We'll write the code later. And then we have this method called render transactions. And then we need to create a method called delete transaction. and we'll also get an ID in that. And then we need to create a method called update balance. Right now, let's go ahead and start writing the code for this. What we will do is we'll create a transactions for now, and we'll just create a static array for now, and later we will store all the data inside the local storage. But for now, we'll just create a const, and we'll just name it transactions. And let's create an array. Now in this we'll have objects. So in the objects we'll have ID, and for the ID I'll just type date.now, which will get the current date, and it will have a unique number. And let's type description, and let's set it to monthly salary. These are just for testing. And let's type amount, and let's set the amount to 3,500. And then we have type, and let's set the type to income. And let's create one more object, and let's type ID, and let's set it to date.now. So date.now returns the number of milliseconds that has elapsed since January 1, 1970. So this will give us a unique ID. And let's type description, and let's set the description to freelance writing. And let's set the amount to -500. So this will be an expense. So let's type type expense. So now that we have created these dummy transactions, let's go ahead and return that. So I'll just type transactions. And if you go ahead and console.log transactions, let's see whether it is being displayed. So let's right click over here and go to inspect. And here we can see we have the array, and in that we have these two transactions. So it is working. So the transactions are basically loaded inside this transactions property inside our object. Right now, let's go ahead and create this render transactions method. So we already have this element referenced, which is called transaction list. So let's use that over here. I'll just type this dot transaction list dot inner HTML, and let's set it equal to blank. So now we can see that we don't have any transactions displayed. And for now, we need to display the transactions from this transactions array. So the transactions array is stored inside this transactions property over here inside our object. So let's loop through all the transactions inside this. So for that, we can just type this dot transactions. And the first thing we will do is we will use the slice method. So the slice method is used to create a copy of your array. So what we will do is we'll just create a copy of the array so that the original is untouched. And then we'll also sort the array so that the last element that was updated is displayed at the top. So let's add a sort. And here for the sort, we will use the compare function. So let's type A, B. These are the two values. And here we need to type B.id minus A.id. So what this will do is basically it will compare these two IDs, and the larger ID will be stored before the smaller ID. So whenever we create a new transaction value, then the date is stored. So once we store the transaction for the first element, the current number of milliseconds that elapsed after January 1, 1970 is stored over here. And when we create one more transaction, we have the value stored over here, but it will be a later value because it is stored after the second one. So in this way, we will have different IDs, and the latest transaction will have a greater ID. So in this way, we will sort the array in which the greater transaction ID will be shown first. Right, after sorting this, let's go ahead and add a for each. And in the for each, we will loop through each of the transactions. So let's type transaction. This will be the name of the individual transactions. So let's create an arrow function over here. And you can name this anything you want. I have just named it transaction. And here the first thing we will do is we'll create a division. So let's type const transaction division equals document.create element, and let's create a div. And if we go back to our HTML file, here we can see that we also have this class added to the div. So we have a class called transaction. So let's type transaction div dot class list dot add, and let's add transaction. And we also need to add one more class, and the other class is basically the type of transaction. So here we can see that we have income, and this class can be income or expense. So for that, we can just get the transaction type. So we have the type over here. So since we are looping through this array, we can just access it. So let's type transaction dot type. So this will add the transaction class and also the type class, which is income or expense, to the div. Right now, let's go ahead and edit the HTML of the transaction div. So let's type transaction div dot inner HTML equals, and let's use backticks. Now here we need to copy the HTML structure. So let's copy this HTML code inside the transaction div and let's paste it over here. Now here we need to change this span content to the description of the transaction. So let's tap $symbol curly braces transaction dot description, because we have the description over here. And then we need to add the amount over here. So here let's type $symbol curly braces transaction dot amount, and then we have the delete button. And for the amount, we'll also use a math.apps function, so that even if we have a lot of decimal places, we just need to display 2 of them. So here let's type math.abs, which is absolute value, and let's add all of this inside the method. And here let's type dot toFixed, and let's set the value to 2. And then for the delete button, we also need to pass the ID of the transaction so that we can delete the correct transaction. So here we will add one more attribute called data-id, and we will set it equal to the transaction ID. So let's type $symbol curly braces transaction.id, and then we have this delete button. And now let's go outside this inner HTML block, and let's go ahead and add the transaction div to the transaction list. So here we have already referenced the transaction list. So let's go ahead and type this dot transaction list dot append child, and let's add the transaction div over here. And now if we go ahead and save this, now we can see that we have the 2 transactions displayed over here. So we have monthly salary and freelance writing, so they are displayed over here. If we change this to, for example, 1,500, they are reflected over here. So the transactions are being displayed correctly, and we also have the correct color being displayed because we are adding the class income and expense to these transactions. Now let's go ahead and add the functionality of deleting the transactions. So let's go back, and here after this for each loop, let's go ahead and type this dot attach delete event listeners. So we'll create this method called attach delete event listeners, and in that we will add event listeners to all the delete buttons. So let's create the function. So let's tap attach delete event listeners, and here first of all let's select all the delete buttons. So let's tap this dot transaction list dot query selector all, and here let's type dot delete button because we have this class of delete button for all the delete buttons. And let's also add a for each over here, and let's select each of these buttons and let's call it button. And here let's type button dot add event listener, and let's listen for the click event. And when the button is clicked, we just call the method called delete transaction, and we need to pass the ID. So the ID is basically inside the button. So we have this data attribute. Now to access the data attribute, you have to type button, which is this button right here, dot dataset dot the name, and we need to convert this into a number. So let's type number over here, and let's add all of this inside it. Right now let's go ahead and add the functionality of delete. So here in the delete transaction method, let's type this dot transactions equals this dot transactions dot filter. So this filter method basically returns an array that meets some specific condition that we added. So here in the condition, let's type transaction dot id is not equal to id. So now what this will do is it will remove all the transactions that has this ID of the ID that we specified over here. So it will basically remove the current transaction. And now let's call this function called render transactions, and we'll also update the balance. So let's type this dot render transactions. Let's type this dot update balance. And now if you go back and if I click on delete, and both the transactions are being deleted. So let's see what's the problem. Let's check whether we have the correct ID. So let's right click over here and go to inspect. Let's go to the delete button, and for the delete button we have this ID of 2953 at the end. And let's check the ID of the second one, and here also we have the same ID. That's because we are creating both these transactions at the same time. Now the ID will not be same if we add the transaction through here. So let's go ahead and add some transaction ID over here. So I'll just tap 1 and 2. Right now let's go back and reload. And now let's click on this delete button, and the correct transaction is deleted. If I click on this one, it is deleted. So everything is working all right. So with that, we have added the functionality of displaying the transactions and deleting it. Now in this video, we will store all of this to the local storage of the browser. So let's get started. So first of all, here we can see that we have these two transactions, and if I click on delete, one of these transactions is deleted. But if I reload this page, we can see that it comes back because they are stored over here inside our code. Now we need to store these transactions inside the local storage so that even if we refresh the page, the state still remains the same. So for that, let's go ahead and delete this transactions array from here. And in the load transactions, we will load the transactions from the local storage. So here, let's go ahead and type return json.parse, and we will get it from local storage.getItem, and we'll get an item called transactions. And if you don't have that, then we'll just return an empty array. And we need to create one more function for saving the transactions to the local storage. So let's type save transactions. And here we can just type local storage.set item, and we can set the key name over here. So let's type transactions. It is the key name. And for the value, let's type json.stringify, and we'll just pass these transactions that we have over here inside our class. So we can just go ahead and type this.transactions. Right, that's it with the save transactions function. Now the next thing we will do is we will add the functionality to display the transactions over here on the right side when we submit using this form. So in this init event listener function, we'll just go ahead and add an event listener to the form. So here we can see that we have already referenced the form in the constructor. So let's go ahead and type this.form.add event listener, and let's listen for the submit event. And when we submit it, we'll just do something with the data. So I'll just call it E. And here I'll just type e.prevent default, which will prevent the default behavior, which is reloading the page. And then we'll just call a function called add transaction. So we'll create a function over here. So before that, let's call it over here. So let's type this.add transaction. And let's add this function over here. So let's type add transaction. And here, first of all, we need to get the details from this form. So let's type const and description equals document.getElementById. And here let's pass the ID of the description, which is description. So if you go back to the HTML file, here we can see that we have this input field with an ID of description. And let's get the value of that. So let's type dot value. And we'll also trim the extra spaces. So let's type trim. And now let's get the amount. So let's type const amount equals document.getElementById. Let's pass the amount ID over here. And let's type dot value. And we'll convert this amount into a float, which is a number with decimals. So let's type parse float, and let's add all of this inside the parentheses. And the next thing we need to get is the type. So let's type const type equals document.getElementById. And let's type type over here, and let's get the value. And now here let's add a basic if condition to check whether all of these values are available. So let's type if exclamation description, which is checking whether we have the description or not. And we'll also type exclamation amount, and let's also check whether this is a number. So let's type is nan. So this will be triggered when we don't have a valid input. And here let's type alert, and let's type please provide a valid description and amount. And we'll just go ahead and return. Right now, let's create a constant called transaction. So let's type const transaction, and it will be an object. And in this, we will have the ID. So we'll just set the ID to date.now, which will get us a unique ID. And let's pass the description. And let's also pass the amount over here. And the amount will be positive if it is an income. and it will be negative if it is an expense. So let's type equals expense, and if it is an expense, then we'll just type minus amount, or else we'll just type amount. And then lastly, we need to get the type. Right now we need to store this transaction constant into our transactions array. So for that, we'll just use the push method inside the array. So let's type this dot transactions dot push, and here let's type transaction, and then we'll call the function called this dot save transactions, which will save it to the local storage. And then let's call the function called render transaction, which we have created in the previous video, which will display our transactions over here on the right side. And then we'll call the function called update balance. So let's type this dot update balance, and then we'll call a function called clear form, which will just remove all the values from these input fields. First of all, let's create this clear form method. So let's type clear form, and let's set it equal to document dot get element by id description, and let's set the value to blank, and we'll do the same for the amount. So let's type document dot get element by id amount, and let's set the value to blank. Right now, let's go to the delete transaction method, and here we need to add some code. So here we'll also call the function called save transaction. So let's type this dot save transactions, and we'll also call the render transactions and update balance. So now let's go back and let's click on delete, and it is not being deleted. So let's go to the inspector, and let's go to the console, and we have an error over here. So let's go to that line. It is on line number 46. So here we have this semicolon. We need to change this to comma, and now we can see that we don't have any transactions. So let's add a new transaction. I'll just type test. Let's add an amount, and let's click on add transaction, and we have this alert. Let's go back and let's see what's the problem. And the problem is that we set an exclamation over here as well, so we need to remove that. We need to check whether it is not a number. So we don't need to add the exclamation over here. It will negate the condition. So let's go back and let's add the transaction. Let's click on add transaction, and it is added over here. And if you go to application, and if you go to the local storage, here we have the transaction, and here we have all the details. We have the ID, the amount, description, and type. Let's add an expense. So let's type test2, and let's type an amount. Let's select expense, and let's click on add transaction. And here for the expense also, it is being displayed as income. So let's go back. Let's see what's the problem. Let's go to the HTML file, and here we can see that we have set the value of expense also to income. So let's change this value to expense. Now let's go back and reload. Let's delete this, and let's add a transaction, and we have the income. Let's add another transaction, and now we can see that the expense is being displayed. So everything is working all right. So that's basically how you can add and remove the values to the local storage. Now in this video, we will update the balance of our application. So let's get started. All right, this is our source code, and here we have this method called update balance, and we need to add the code inside this. And for updating the balance, we're going to use the reduce method in JavaScript. Now first of all, let me explain to you how the reduce method works. Now there are different ways of calculating the balance and displaying it over here. One of the common ways is to use a for each loop and create a total value over here. And you can just loop through the transactions and add all the amount and just update the total value. So for example, you can just create a total variable like this and set it to 0, and then just loop through each of the transactions by using a for each. So you can just type transactions.for each or something like that. But in this video, we're going to use a method called reduce, which will help us eliminate this line of code, and it will calculate the total value just using the reduce method. All right, first of all, let me show you the syntax of the reduce method. So for that, we need to first of all use the reduce method in an array. So we can just type array name dot reduce. Now here the first argument is a callback function, and the second argument is the initial value. So let's type initial value over here. And in this callback function, we need to have two parameters. One is the accumulator, and the other is the current value. So we'll have these two parameters inside this callback function, and here we can do the operation. Now in our case, we need to loop through all the transactions, and the accumulator is basically where the total value will be stored, and the initial value will be where it starts from. So for example, if we just type 0 as the initial value, then the total will start from 0, and this current value is basically what we use to represent the single items inside the array. So for example, if we have an array over here, so let's create an array called transactions, and in that, let's say we have an amount, and let's add some amount over here. And for the second one, let's type -50, and let's add one more amount. So we have these amounts over here, and it is inside this array. So now here we can go ahead and type transactions dot reduce, and for the accumulator we can just type total. So this will accumulate all the values. All the values will be added up and stored inside this total variable. And then for each of the transactions, we can just call it anything we want. I'll just call it transaction. You can also name this variable anything you want. And here by default you have set the initial value to 0. Now here in this callback function we can return values. So let's type return, and we need to return the total amount. So we can just type total plus transaction dot amount. So what we are basically doing over here is that we are looping through all these transactions, and the total value is set to 0 by default in the beginning, and then we loop through the transactions array, and for each of the single transactions we are calling a transaction over here, and here we are returning the total, which is 0 right now, plus the transaction amount, which we have over here, which is 100. Now when this callback function runs once again, it will have a value of 100 for the total, and then we again go to the next item, and it has this value of -50. So then we have 100 plus -50, which is 50, and then for the next item we will have a total of 50, and then we'll go ahead and get the amount from the next transaction, which is 200. So 50 plus 200 will be 250, and let me just go ahead and console.log all of this over here so you can better understand it. So I'll just type total, and let's set it to total, and let's type console.log transaction amount, and let's set it to transaction dot amount. So now let's go back to our website, and let's open the console, and here we can see we have the total value of 0 at the beginning, and then we have this transaction amount of 100, and then we have the total of 100, and then we have transaction amount of -50, and then we have total of 50, and then we have transaction amount of 200. And then lastly, we will have a total of 250, which is not displayed over here. It will be returned at the end of this function. So let's create a const called balance, and let's console.log it over here. So let's type console.log balance, and let's set it to balance. And now if you go back to our website, here we can see that we have a balance of 250 displayed, and it is the correct value. Now since we have just one line of code for our calculation, we can just go ahead and omit this return keyword, and we can just simply go ahead and remove these curly braces from here, and this will go ahead and simply return the value. So now if you go back, here we can see we have a balance of 250. So this is how the reduce method works. Now let's use this in our application. Alright, so here we have the update balance method. So let's do the same thing over here. Let's create a const called balance, and let's set it equal to this dot transactions, which is this property right here inside our object, and let's use the reduce method. So let's type dot reduce, and here let's type total, and for each of the transaction I'll just call it transaction, and here we'll just return total plus transaction dot amount, and for the initial value let's set it to 0, and this is our reduce method. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to update the balance and show it over here in our web page. So if we go back to our class, here we can see that we have this balance element, and we are getting this balance ID from here. So here we have this balance ID. So let's go ahead and update this. Let's go back over here, and let's type this dot balance element dot text content, and let's set it to balance of $, and here let's type balance, and let's set it to 2 fixed of 2, so that we'll have just 2 digits after the decimal point. And now if we go back here, we can see that we have the balance displayed over here. Let's delete this, and the balance is being updated correctly. Let's add a new income. And here we can see that the balance is being updated correctly. Now if we have a negative balance, we need to have a different color, and for the positive balance we need to have kind of a green color. So let's do that. So here let's type this dot balance element dot style dot color equals balance, and let's check whether the balance is greater than or equal to 0, and if it is, then we'll set the color to 2ECC71, and if this is not the case, if the balance is in negative, then we'll just set the color to E74C3C. And now if you go back, here we can see that the balance is displayed in green. Now let's add an expense, and let's set the balance to a negative amount. So let's add an expense, and let's set it to 20,000, and let's change this to expense and click on add transaction. And now we can see that the balance is updated and it is in negative, and we have the correct color for the balance displayed as well. So everything is working all right. So that's basically how you can use the reduce method in JavaScript to calculate the balance of our budget tracker app. Right, here I have logged into my Blogger dashboard, and we can add this to a page or a post. So if you want to add it into a page, you can just go over here to pages and click on new page and then add the code over there. But I'll just go over here to posts and let's click on new post, and let's add our code inside a post. So I'll just set the title to budget tracker, and the first thing you need to do is change this into the HTML view. So click on this button and click on HTML view. Now here you can add your HTML, CSS and JavaScript code. So first of all, let's add our CSS. I'll just create a style tag for that, and let's go to our source code, and let's copy the CSS from here. So here we have the style.css file. I'll just copy everything from here. I'll just skip the styles of the body and this asterisk selector, because it will affect everything inside our theme. So I'll just copy this root. Let's paste it over here, and let's copy everything after the body. So from here till the end, and let's paste it over here. And now let's go ahead and add our HTML. So let's go to our index.html file, and let's copy our app container division from here, and let's paste it right here. Right now let's go ahead and paste our JavaScript. So let's create a script tag for that, and let's go to our source code. Let's go to the main.js file. Let's copy all this JavaScript from here and paste it right here. Now if you take a look at this, we can see that we have the HTML over here, and you can change the heading and all these things to whatever you need. And if you scroll down here, we have the JavaScript code, so you can make changes to all these things over here. So here we can see we have an alert. You can change these to your needs, and you can also change the color of this balance. So for example, if we have a negative balance, let's add an expense which will make it negative, and let's click on add transaction. Now we can see that it has this red color for the balance. So in this way you can change the colors of the balance text over here. So it is right here. Right, once you have made all the changes, you can just go ahead and click on publish and confirm. And here we can see our post is published. So let's click on the view button, and here we can see our budget tracker app is being displayed over here. Let's add a transaction. I'll just add an income. Let's type salary, and let's add an income over here. Let's click on add transaction, and we can see that the transaction is added over here. But we have some problems in our styling, so we'll fix that as well. Let's add an expense, and let's see how it looks. So let's type rent. Let's add an amount over here, and let's select expense over here, and let's click on add transaction. And now we can see that the balance was updated, and we also have the transaction history displayed over here. And if I reload this page, the data still remains because we are storing this inside a local storage of the browser. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what is the problem with this text. So let's right click over here and go to inspect, and here we have our text, and let's increase the width a little bit, and now let's scroll down to the CSS and let's see what's the issue. So here we have a line height added to the post body by default along with the theme. So if I remove that, we have the correct styling. So let's say what's the line height we need. So I'll just type 1.5 or let's type 1.2, and I think 1.2 looks alright. So let's target this text. So if we take a look at this, here we can see that we have this ID of balance. So let's go back to our post. Let's go to the CSS and let's go to the balance, and here let's add a line height and let's set it to 1.2 and let's update this. Let's go back and reload this page, and now we can see that it looks alright. We also need to change the line height of this heading. So I'll just go ahead and set the line height to the whole app container. So here let's type line height. Let's set it to 1.2 and let's update. Let's go back over here and reload. And now we can see that it looks alright. So let's take a look at the mobile version, and this is how it looks on smaller screens. So everything looks alright. So that's basically how you can add this budget tracker to your Blogger website. Alright, so that's basically it for this video. If you have any doubts, you can ask in the comments below. And if you like this video, please click on the like button and subscribe to this channel to get the latest video updates. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a nice day.